So today's video is going to be around specifically how to mediate between people in conflicts, how to be a peacekeeper, in other words. So the reason this topic is very important is because you're going to have situations in your life where you're going to need to keep the peace between two people. And this is a role that I played from a very early age in life, only because of the limitations of my childhood. Let's put it that way, parentally. And so I didn't have to, but I chose to play that role because when you're being the peacekeeper, what you're trying to do is not create any more unnecessary conflict because it is beneficial to all parties involved for there to be peace, right? For there to be mutual understanding, cooperation, agreement. So specifically, this is not about somebody complaining to you about somebody you don't know and you just take their side, right? And you just agree with them with everything that they say so they can feel like they're heard and seen, and then that's the conversation. This is not what I'm talking about. This is a conversation where two parties, like the peace needs to be kept. It's not like a toxic boss or anything like that. Those are not the types of scenarios I'm talking about. Types of scenarios I'm talking about is that you're talking with a family member and they're having issues with their spouse, for example, or you're trying to mediate a conflict between two people within your family or two of your friends, for example. So these are situations where, and there's no person that's clearly so-called at fault for the situation, which means there was no egregious actions being taken, no insulting words being thrown that were like that are just obvious, where it's one person needs to basically reflect and come back to the table and make amends, right? It's a bit more nuanced than that. And this, if you're still with me, this is probably resonating with you because this is kind of a more nuanced topic and not a topic a lot of people actually care about. But it's important because you're going to have a lot of times in your life, or like your business owner, two of your employees, right? A lot of times, like these situations are going to emerge. And let's take the instance where you can't speak to the other person, right? So let's take two different instances, where one where you can and one where you can't, right? And in the situation where you can, you have to find out first of all if both parties are open to you speaking to them, right? If they're not, then you just speak to whatever party is open to speaking with you, and then we'll address that in scenario two. But scenario one is where you're speaking to both people. So what you're trying to do here is, first of all, get the story from both sides from their perspective, what happened. And it's important to, when you speak to the first person, to get the complete picture and have an understanding of like how they felt specifically, how they're feeling, what kind of emotions were evoked, what did they think that it meant, the situation meant to them, how did they interpret that situation. So you have to get all of that information. And typically speaking, if you can, like if you're going to speak to both people, you want to be able to speak to the person who you feel is a little bit more maybe emotionally reactive first, right? You want to speak to them first because I'll explain why. Because once you get all of that information and once they kind of like get everything out and tell you, then when you go to person two and you tell them specifically, okay, you ask them what happened, and then you get their side of the story. And as you're telling them specifically how this other person felt, is you're not making the other person right, and you're not making the person that you're speaking to right. You're just basically communicating that even though the situation on the surface seemed like it was very tumultuous, it's because this other person was going through these things. And so that's something that they were not aware of, right? So you're just making it known to them. And because they're less emotionally reactive than the first person that you spoke to, or maybe more rational, who knows, they're more likely to understand the position of that person, right? Versus if you go to the more calm person or the more rational person first, they might tell you not as much as the more emotionally reactive person. The more emotionally reactive person might tell you more, or they might tell you things that are more painful to them. And then when you go to them, you can't really tell them about what they were feeling. You can to some degree, but it's not going to be as effective as if you took the reverse approach. So essentially what you're trying to do is share with them, not make anybody right, but tell them, so and so was feeling, in this particular way, and this is how they interpret it. Clearly that's not what your intention was. Like, you want to also make assumptions, right? You want to make assumptions, positive assumptions, right? You always want to make positive assumptions. Like, clearly, I know that wasn't your intention, right? And I know you had good things, like you had good intentions, like you wanted to be able to like establish communication. You want to say that to both people, right? You want to basically assume the best from the person and communicate that assumption to them, because what you're doing is you're essentially allowing them to inhabit the frame or the worldview of a person who is trying to do good, because deep down inside they actually were. Like, nobody wants destroyed relationships. Nobody intentionally goes through a conflict or has an issue because they want the relationship to be destroyed, right? There's that tiny minority where the relationship is actually ending and it should end, but most people don't have that intention. They also don't know how to frame it that way, and they also, it's very unlikely that a lot of people would tell you that um, they only had good intentions, right? They're not going to be like overly self-congratulatory. So you want to be able to be the one who congratulates them, right? On their efforts, on the fact that they tried to resolve the situation. You don't want to make any accusations, right? Tell, you don't want to tell the other person anything that would uh, that would make them feel like you're judging them in any way, shape, or form, right? And like I said, in a negative direction, right? When you're making assumptions, you're not necessarily judging, but you're just telling them how what they did was, like, it's very commendable, right? What you're doing is very commendable because you're trying to resolve the conflict, right? So what I want to do is just make sure that both sides are heard, and that you both understand each other, because clearly there's misunderstanding, there's miscommunication. Like, I know you said that, but he didn't mean it, right? Or she didn't mean it. Is that it was just kind of like heat of the moment and things are just being said, right? They like, he or she wants to squash this. Like, they want to resolve the conflict. They want to be able to be more connected, right? That's why they felt like it was a safe enough space for them to have this argument or this disagreement. Now, clearly, it didn't go the way that both of you wanted it to go, but nevertheless, he feels, or she feels like this is something that they want to be able to work with you on, and you guys can have an agreement about. So this is not about like a mediator as far as like you coming up with like a solution, because two parties are negotiating. You're not basically mediating a negotiation. This is not a negotiation, right? Because the negotiation, that's a whole different topic that needs to be discussed in a separate video. We're talking about just keeping the peace, right? This is what this video is about, just keeping the peace, right? In a situation where you can't speak to the other person, for whatever reason, and you're only speaking to one person, then what you have to do there is fully understand. Now, here's the thing that's very important when you're speaking to only one person. You do not want to cast the other person in any type of negative light, or any type of light that would not allow the other person or their uh, facilitate a more positive perspective around that situation, right? You also don't want to make excuses, right? You need to have like a good balance of both, right? You don't want to just say, oh, maybe she meant that, or maybe that's not what she meant, or he didn't want intended for you to interpret, for you to be for you to interpret the situation this way. You don't want to keep saying stuff like that over and over again, right? In different forms, right? Where they're basically telling you what they said, and then you're excusing the other person, right? That's not something that you want to do. What you want to do is you want to hear everything, and then you want to basically summarize. Just like, if I understand you correctly, right? Um, you're saying that, say, for example, you want to, take some extra time and do this other project on the side. And even though you have some kind of like outcome associated with this project, this other person uh, is more outcome oriented. So basically, they want to be sure that you're going to be completing this thing. And even though your intention is to complete it, you feel like that is putting more added pressure on you, or it's kind of like killing the magic when we're doing this thing. And so you want them to be able to agree with you with your summary, right? You want to be able to for them to agree with you with your summary. They want to be able to feel heard and understood. Now, the second thing that you want to do here is you want to encourage communication. So basically, what you want to tell them is, you first of all, you want to ask them. So everything that you're telling me in the way that you're telling me, that you tell them the same thing. Now, it's going to be 50-50. Sometimes it's going to be yes, sometimes it's going to be no. When it's going to be no, you have to ask yourself, well, do you think it'd be helpful if you communicated that? I mean, like, even though you think they might not understand, you think it's best for them to maybe like understand, where you're coming from, and for you guys to have a conversation and make sure that you set it up so that like the setting is right and you're both kind of calm, and you approach a situation from a perspective where neither of you are stressed, right? Neither of you are overwhelmed. And maybe if you are stressed, you pick a time where you're not and have this conversation, right? So that's going to be very important. If they have spoken to them about it, that's if they haven't, right? If they have spoken to them about it, you want to be able to get as much information as possible, so they feel a little bit more. There's a reason it's called venting, right? Or releasing the pressure, because when something vents, right, it relaxes, right? The thing that is venting is also simultaneously relaxing. There's not so much pressure built up, because the implication is that there's pressure. So when somebody's venting, it's basically they're relaxing that pressure. So you also have to allow the other person to vent, right? You have to allow the other person to say what they need to say. And oftentimes what will happen is, by just asking questions, is that they're like asking thoughtful questions, right? As far as, okay, and like, what do you think that would, like, what kind of like result do you think that would produce? Um, or like, I mean, do you think that's what, like, you want and this other person wants, he wants or she wants? Okay, right. So you're basically asking questions, thoughtful questions, and listening. Now, I can't tell you the specific questions because I don't know what your scenario is, but you want to be able to ask thoughtful questions that are non-judgmental, that do not make it seem like you're taking the other person's side. If anything, you want to slightly be able to be more, quote unquote, on the side of the person speaking to you, because they're the one speaking to you. Because if you take the other person's side, it's almost like, yeah, you want to be able to support them because they're absent. You don't want to agree with any kind of like negative assessments that they're making about the other person. You do not want to do that. So even though you're listening and you're kind of supportive to them, because how can you take the other person's side if they're not around, right? You also don't want to defend them because you have no idea what they said. All you're hearing is the other person's perspective, right? There's two people in the conversation, let's say, for example, and you're speaking to person A and person B, you're speaking to person B. So if you take person A's side, you have no idea what actually happened. So basically what you're doing is you're coming up with hypotheticals in your head as to why this other person may have been correct. But you get asked things like, do you think that they maybe meant, this thing? Like I said, you don't want to do that all the time. You want to pepper that in, right? It's like, as far as, okay, well, what do you think their intention was? Do you think like their intention was like bad? Or, I mean, do you think it was good? Like, what place do you think it was coming from? So you can see the way I'm asking these questions is the way I would ask the questions, right? It's like tonality, right? You're kind of like pulling back a little bit. You're not saying things like, well, I mean, do you think what they were saying was like bad? Like, do you think it was intended to hurt you? Because it doesn't, it's the way you ask the question based off the person that you're speaking to, and whatever you know about them. So you want to be able to ask questions that kind of imply the goodness, for example, positive intentions of the other person, but not repeatedly. You want to pepper that in. And what you want to do mostly is listen to the other person, listen to the person that you're actually speaking to, try to summarize their points, try to ask them particular questions as far as like, what do you think a solution would be? Or like, what's the best way to resolve it, in between like their venting and stuff like that, and all the, understanding that you're showing the other person. And then what'll happen usually is that there's going to be some obvious resolution that comes to the table. You need to be able to pay attention and grab these opportunities when they present themselves, because oftentimes what will happen is they'll come to a conclusion by themselves. You don't want to basically offer a bunch of solutions, right? This is something that I probably should have mentioned near the beginning of the video. You don't want to offer a bunch of solutions, right? That's not your role, right? That's not your goal, because you want them to come up with the solution. You want the other person, right, or the other people to be able to take ownership and responsibility over the decision that they're coming to. Number one, because it gives them the power. They feel like they're the ones that make the decision. So it's going to be more likely to stick. Number one. And number two is people in general, they don't like to be told what to do, because also they're not resolving the problems that they have by speaking about them. So if you're just offering a solution, the solution may be the right solution, but because the other person feels like you haven't properly understood the problem, first of all, they don't feel like you understand them, so they're less likely to come to you again in the future. It's going to create more conflict because they feel like you haven't listened to what they came to you for, right? Or what you came to them for, which is basically a conversation for them to really get everything out to the surface. And then also, once everything comes up to the surface, there might be a solution that you thought was a solution, which actually wasn't. So you think there's a solution, but now you're learning more pieces to the puzzle. So because you made an assumption, you're not going to be able to actually find the real solution later by getting all that information. So keep all those things in mind, right? What you want to do basically here is you want to hear both sides if possible. If you can't do that, you want to be able to, in scenario one, like I said, when you're speaking to both people, you want to speak to the person that's more emotionally reactive first. You want to get their story, you want to get their side of things. You want to do the approach that I mentioned in scenario two, but once you go to the other person, you want to be able to vouch for them and simultaneously, because again, when you're speaking to person two first, person B, where you're speaking to both people, you're speaking to person B who's more emotionally reactive. They're giving you all the information, right? You're going to person A, you're hearing their story. Then what you're doing is you're peppering in information about, like, maybe this other person, meant this or meant that, right? But you're also trying to relay the positive qualities of the other person when you're doing this mediation. So, and you're doing this with person B and with person A, because what you want to do is you want to assume the best, right? You want to assume that the other person has the best interests of the relationship at heart, because they probably do. Nobody engages in a disagreement or a conflict and they just want to keep it that way. Like, people typically, they will argue and they will have a conflict with somebody is because they have some kind of problem, and problems just call out to be resolved, right? They just need to be resolved. Sometimes it's an emotional resolution, sometimes it's more like technical resolution. There's different types of resolutions. But again, you want to be very strategic when you're speaking to both people, right? You want to take the approach that you're taking when you're speaking to only one person, and use it with both people, and then also communicate to both sides that, from what you heard, they had the other's best interest at heart. And there's probably some kind of like miscommunication or misinterpretation because you heard both stories, right? Because you heard both stories. And then ideally what you want to do is, if you're speaking to a more emotionally reactive person first, then you speak to the less emotionally reactive person, you want to go back to the first person. So you need to be able to do this as many times as required until you feel like they're ready to speak to each other. Maybe it's one time, right? Maybe you speak to person B, then person A, and then they can get together and resolve it. Maybe it's person B, then person A, then person B, they resolve it. Maybe it's person B, A, and then they resolve it, right? So you want to be able to do this as many times as you think is required, right? Because if they're not going to be engaging, then you might need to mediate the situation if this relationship is important and the peace needs to be kept, right? Scenario two is the one I described, where you're speaking to only one person, and you have to keep all of those things in mind that I mentioned, because you cannot the other person doesn't have anybody on their side. So you want to be able to like pepper in some kind of like potential, maybe like there's a misunderstanding or they had positive intentions, but you don't want to do that repeatedly. You want to pepper that in with listening to the other person, talk about their problems, talk about the situation, talk about their emotions, vent, right? And then ask strategic questions as far as like, well, did you speak to them about that? Or what does this mean as far as like potentially moving forward? Or it's like, oh, where did this come from? So you're asking questions to try to put things together. And as you're putting things together for you, they're also putting things together. So when you ask the right questions, is they're also creating the puzzle, because they're the ones speaking. So they're the ones kind of like putting the pieces on the table, because people think by actually speaking. So they're putting the pieces on the table, and then sometimes a solution is going to be obvious, and they're either going to come up with it, or it's going to be obvious, and they're going to be like, and then you might be able to say, do you think that that's maybe a possible like solution? That's maybe like a possible approach. I'm like, okay, maybe, right? Or no, and they'll tell you why. And then you just like kind of keep figuring it out. So keep that in mind. This is a very delicate dance, right? That we're playing here when we're peacekeepers, mediators, if you will. But hope that was helpful, because you're going to come in, you're going to probably have situations in your life where this is going to happen, and you don't want to feel powerless, right? You don't want to feel helpless. That's the last thing that you want to do. Now, sometimes obviously you can't control everything, because you're not, that relationship is their relationship. So you can't control everything. You want to do everything that you possibly can. And sometimes you'll realize that, you can't be as effective as you want to be. But, the only way to actually determine that is for you to do this and to find out how effective you can be. And don't despair if you can't, quote unquote, get it right the first time, or if you kind of like annoy the other person, and you know what I mean, the conversation is not as fruitful as you would have liked it to be. You're making an effort, right? And then you're learning from your mistakes, right? Just like everything that we do on this channel. So yeah, I hope that was helpful, and I'll leave it there. If you like the video, make sure you like it, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought, if you liked it, if you didn't like it, if you disagreed with me, if you have a question, let me know. You can DM me on X, follow me there as well if you want, and subscribe to my newsletter, because I'm publishing articles too. So that's it for me. Until next time, I'll see you soon.